Good evening to you, Greg. Hi, Greg. Nice to see you. Don't seem to have too many people here tonight. Thank you for coming. I see a good many shares already. So you must be very busy. Thanks. I really appreciate it. Some more people have joined. I don't see them yet. But my indicator says that there are a few more people who have joined us. So good evening to you, whoever you are. So yesterday I was talking about, and I worked my way through an article from a special issue of the American Prospect on the Green New Deal. And we talked about that for some time. It's a great issue, and it has a number of really excellent articles in it. And tonight I wanted to go through a few of those. One is called Getting to a Carbon-Free Economy, and that's by Jeffrey Sachs, a very well-known economist. Okay, a second is called The Technical Path to zero carbon. That was written by Mara Prentice. And that focuses still more on the technical issues, while Jeffrey Sachs's focuses on some technical issues and also costs. And then thirdly, there's an article that focuses entirely on how we're going to pay for it and assumptions about costs and such like and stuff like that. And that's called How Do We Pay for a Zero Emissions Economy? And that's by Robert by Robert Pollin, a very well-known economist from the University of Massachusetts, who also has costed out the Medicare for All plan, okay, of Bernie Sanders, and it was written very favorably about it. These were all published on December 5th of 2019 in the American Prospect. So let's get to the first of these articles. Which is the one by Jeffrey Sachs. And shifting over to that, you see a very nice photo with the title superimposed on it. Here's a photo of a combined solar, okay, and wind farm. And with the caption, "Getting to a carbon-free economy. The urgent is attainable and at entirely affordable cost." So you can tell the article already presents some very good news for people who are supporting the idea of getting to a carbon-free economy. This is a stock photo from Getty near the Winchester Mountains in Arizona. 450-foot tall wind turbines and fields of solar panels produce electricity for the city of Tucson. The costs of renewable energy have plummeted, especially solar photovoltaics. Now I'll go to Clearly to make this easier to read. And so this first starts off with some distinctions. Green New Deal refers to two distinct ideas. The narrower idea, which I discuss here, so he's already telling you the article is focusing on the narrower idea, specifically the strategy to decarbonize the U.S. energy system in line with the Paris Agreement. It should be noted that what people have lately been saying is that the Paris Agreement is not aggressive enough, and that we have to have targets that are still more that are actually still more aggressive than outlined in the Paris Agreement. So we have to keep this in mind when we go through here. So Sachs also points out the broader urgent idea is an integrated program including renewable energy, infrastructure, healthcare, education, and jobs. And that is the combination Green New Deal program, which involves the decarbonization, okay, of the economy, and not simply the decarbonization in terms of not putting any more carbon into the air, but even getting carbon out of it. And of course, it includes having a just transition to such an economy, and specifically to the broader idea of the Green New Deal. So Jeff Sachs says, contrary to some commentaries, decarbonization will not require a grand mobilization of the U.S. economy on a par with World War II. The incremental costs of decarbonization above our normal energy costs will amount to 1 to 2% of U.S. GDP per year during the period to 2050. By contrast, during World War II, federal outlay soared to 43% of GDP from the pre-war level of 10% of GDP in 1940. So, right now the federal budget is, I guess it's about 18, 19, 20%, okay, of GDP. Okay, at this point, in the post-war years, following the Second World War, up through the 1970s, the federal budget ran between, ran about 25% of GDP and maybe a little bit more. Since then, with the rise, of neoliberalism, the federal budget has fallen down to 18 or 19%, of GDP, because according to the neoliberals, we can't afford it anymore. Okay. So I guess, not wanting to alarm the more conservative among us, but Jeffrey Sachs is at pains to emphasize that, well, maybe this is going to result, just the decarbonization part is going to amount to a rise to maybe 20 to 21% of GDP, or 20 to 22%, of GDP during the period from 2021 to 2050. So just getting there, according to Jeffrey Sachs, is not going to require much change. It really all depends whether you want to implement the broad idea of a Green New Deal or whether you just want to decarbonize. So that's what's implied by these opening paragraphs of the article. The key today is to redirect outlays now spent on fossil fuel-based technologies towards zero-carbon technologies instead. The redirection will require a serious increase in federal and state public infrastructure spending, but most importantly will depend on new federal and state by regulations to redirect the energy-related spending. Carbon pricing, such as a carbon tax, will be one useful tool for redirecting the spending, but will be of less importance than the regulations. Then, under the heading of limiting global temperature rise, Jeffrey Sachs says, the core goal of the Paris Agreement is to strengthen the global response to climate change by holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, recognizing this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. But the IPCC followed the Paris Agreement with a crucial study in 2018, And of course, since 2018, the IPCC is getting more, has been placing more and more emphasis on the grave risks of exceeding the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, pointing out that they underestimated a number of things, and new studies are highlighting that global warming is happening much faster than we thought. Going on anyway, there are three kinds of dire risks. First, the global damages from 2 degrees of warming would be significantly higher than from 1.5 degrees, compared to the pre-industrial levels. Second, even 1.5 degrees may be well above the threshold for major irreversibilities, such as a multi-meter rise in the sea level caused by the partial disintegration of the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. Third, increases in temperature above 1.5 degrees threaten to unleash powerful positive feedbacks that could lead to a spiraling of further warming, such as the massive release of CO2 and methane from the melting permafrost. And Jeffrey Sachs points out that a superb, comprehensive scientific overview of several of these issues was written by James Hansen and co-authors. And he links to that study. And then says, see here for an up-to-date account of possible large-scale positive feedback effects that could dramatically amplify climate change. Indeed, the long-term risks of even a 1.5 degree warming sustained over decades or centuries are so high that we must be more ambitious than merely stabilizing at 1.5 degrees. Hansen cogently argues that we should return to CO2 concentrations to levels consistent with a long-term warming of just 1 degree Celsius. Well, that goes beyond, of course, the Paris Climate Agreement. That means that after reaching a peak CO2 concentration of perhaps 450 parts per million, and by the way, we don't have far to go to get there. According to some of the latest information, we've already passed 416 parts per million. And it's still going up. Anyway, reaching a peak CO2 concentration of perhaps 450 parts per million or less at mid-century, we should enter a sustained phase of global net negative CO2 emissions, so that CO2 concentrations gradually return to 350 parts per million over the long term, or ideally even sooner. I'm not entirely sure what Sachs means by the long term here, but I think he means the remainder of this century between 2050 and 2100. Besides phasing out carbon emissions, this goal can be accomplished through two kinds of carbon storage: geological storage, capturing CO2 in the air, and pumping it into geologic reservoirs. And biological storage, afforestation, reforestation, and restoration of degraded lands, or capturing CO2 in vegetative cover and soils. So there it is, the kind of carbon engineering we talked about some time ago, using big machines to get carbon out of the air and then dispose of the carbon by dumping it into reservoirs below ground. To stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, all regions of the world should reach net zero emissions by 2050 at the very latest. The U.S. currently represents around 15% of global CO2 emissions, and that share will decline in the coming years. Therefore, decarbonization of the U.S. energy system must be complemented by decisive actions abroad but the U.S. needs to lead. The Green New Deal should include a pillar for U.S. diplomacy and international economic policy designed to speed actions abroad, not only in the United States. At a minimum, the U.S. must remain a leader of the Paris Agreement. I think it's got to do more than that. Anyway, 5 technological pillars of decarbonization is the next section, and Jeff starts off with hundreds of scholarly and policy studies have reached a broad consensus on the technology pathways to decarbonization. The consensus points to 5 pillars. The first and most important pillar is zero carbon electricity. This is the most important measure, since zero carbon electricity can be deployed directly in battery electric vehicles, for example, and indirectly in green chemistry to manufacture zero carbon fuels, hydrogen, for example. Zero carbon electricity involves a shift towards zero carbon primary energy sources and a very significant overall expansion of electricity production for the electrification of transport, buildings, and industry. Zero carbon electricity worldwide will tap a number of primary energy sources, including renewables, broadly defined to include wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, ocean, and tidal. So nuclear, biofuels, and carbon capture and storage of fossil fuel-generated electricity. Recent global studies have emphasized the core role of renewables and zero-carbon electricity. This is because the costs of renewable energy have plummeted, especially solar photovoltaics, while non-renewable energy sources, nuclear, biofuels, and carbon capture, each pose major technical and social obstacles leading to public opposition. Nuclear power, of course, raises massive concerns over nuclear accidents, and nuclear wastes, and nuclear terrorism, by the way, also. See the companion article by Alexander Salmon. We haven't gotten to that article yet, but we will look into it down the line. Biofuel raises great concerns about ecosystem degradation and competition with food supplies. Carbon capture raises a really massive opposition over technological doubts, i.e. leakage of CO2 on land use obstacles, e.g. pipelines to carry the CO2 and high costs. The second pillar of decarbonization is the electrification of end uses. There are many sectors currently using fossil fuel energy that can be converted to direct use of green electricity. These include battery electric vehicles, or BEVs, heat pumps for residential and commercial buildings, but also electric cooking, e.g. induction and microwave stoves, and direct reduction of ores in metallurgy. These pathways of electrification seem more likely today than just a few years ago. Major automakers are now making significant commitments to electric vehicles, for example, with dates set for the phase-out of conventional internal combustion engine vehicles. The third pillar is green synthetic fuels for economic sectors not easily electrified. In aviation transport, there is continuing debate about the feasibility of electrification. It seems increasingly likely that electrification will cover short-haul flights, e.g. under 1 hour, but that longer-haul flights will continue to require liquid fuels of high energy density. These synthetic fuels can be manufactured using by green electricity. And then there's a reference to the companion article by Mara Prentice, which we will address in a little while here. The fourth pillar is a smart power grid built on big data, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things. The idea of a smart grid is a self-regulating system that can shift among multiple sources of power generation. And and also multiple uses to provide reliable and low-cost systems operations, despite the variability of the renewable energy. On the supply side, a smart grid will integrate variable renewable energy from many sources in order to smooth the variability of power generation. Also, a larger connected grid covering more geography and more sources of variable renewable energy will reduce variation of power. Various storage options, including batteries, pumped hydro, compressed air, and conversion of the renewable energy into synthetic fuels will help to stabilize the supply side. Okay, the demand side will also show flexibility by enabling smart meters to turn on and off electricity consumption of users depending on temporal needs, urgency, and shifts in market prices that reflect supply-demand conditions. The fifth pillar is energy and materials efficiency to economize on the use of primary energy and on the plastics, and metals, cement, and other industrial materials that emit CO2 in their production and use. Improved materials and material flows, popularly known as, quote, reduce, reuse, and recycle, unquote, or, quote, circular economy, unquote, can significantly improve energy and materials efficiency, reduce the process emissions of CO2, such as in the manufacture of clinker for cement, and slash energy inputs needed for industrial processes. Okay, the next section, or what you can see is quite a comprehensive article, is on easier and harder sectors. Decarbonization of electric power will be relatively straightforward, though there remain important challenges to managing power grids that are fully dependent on renewable energy. Low carbon sources, power sources such as photovoltaics and wind, have already come down dramatically in cost, so that their levelized costs, that is, their long-term costs, including the costs of capital investments, are already competitive with fossil fuels. The biggest operational challenges arise from the intermittency of the renewables and their limited dispatchability, that is, the relative inability of renewable energy sources to ramp up and down quickly in response to market needs. There are two complementary solutions to intermittency. One is power storage, for example, in grid-scale batteries, synthetic fuels, e.g. hydrogen, and systems such as pumped hydro, in which excess renewable energy is used to pump water into an uphill reservoir for later use in hydroelectric power generation. The other solution is geographical diversification of renewable energy sources through a large interconnected grid. A more extended grid reduces the variability of power generation by relative to the average load and therefore reduces the need for energy storage as a percentage of the average load. As for dispatchability, storage solutions such as pumped hydro and synthetic fuels, e.g. hydrogen, offer the necessary dispatchability. End quote. We need to enter a sustained phase of global net negative CO2 emissions so that these concentrations gradually return to 350 parts per million over the long term. Some downstream users of fossil fuels will be easily electrified, while others will be difficult or impossible to electrify. Light-duty vehicles and urban delivery vans, for example, will almost certainly shift soon from internal combustion engines to zero-emission battery electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. This hydrogen will have to be produced in zero-emission manner, such as by hydrolysis using renewable energy, or by fossil fuels combined with carbon capture and storage. Other transport modes, long-distance trucking, ocean shipping, and aviation, are hard sectors in that their electrification is much less straightforward or out of reach. Onboard batteries are heavy and take up considerable volume needed for freight. Other solutions, such as synthetic green fuels or biofuels for aviation, hydrogen fuel cells for ocean shipping, and catenary lines for electric trucks along major highway routes will be necessary. The recent report by the Energy Transitions Commission, quote, Mission Possible, reaching net zero carbon emissions from harder to abate sectors by mid-century, unquote, and the FEEM SDSN report, quote, Roadmap to 2050, Power Industry, Transport and Buildings, unquote, discuss the technology possibilities for the harder sectors. So he refers you to those publications to look at what we think is possible right now for the harder sectors. Most new buildings will be relatively easy to electrify using electric heat pumps and overall improvements in insulation and ventilation. Older buildings that currently rely on fossil fuel heating will have to be retrofitted for electric heat pumps. Retrofitting will require a long national effort and will be moderately expensive. Major challenges remain in decarbonizing certain industrial sectors, including metallurgy, petrochemicals, cement, and other heavy industries that intensively use fossil fuels for process heating and feedstocks. There will be no one-size-fits-all strategy. Certain kinds of process heating can be electrified, others not, at least currently. Certain feedstocks can be replaced by non-carbon emitting materials, others not, at least currently. Then Jeffrey offers a timeline for decarbonization. He says, the essence of decarbonization is the replacement of today's fossil fuel using capital stock with a new zero-carbon capital stock. Now, he's not talking money here. He's talking real capital. In other words, the material things that are one meaning, of capital. The material things that are used to produce other things. Coal-fired power plants need to be phased out. A very good example of a certain kind of capital stock, and replaced by renewable energy power generation. Internal combustion engine vehicles need to be phased out and replaced by electric vehicles. Boilers and furnaces in buildings need to be phased out and replaced by electric heat pumps, and so forth. The least cost solution in each case is to retire the existing capital at the end of its normal life and replace it with zero carbon capital. Cars and trucks last 15 to 20 years, power plants 30 to 50 years, buildings 50 to 100 years, and so forth. This means that with the natural lifespan of vehicles, we would require 15 to 20 years from the first date at which all new vehicles brought to the market are zero-emission vehicles. The alternative strategy, which is more costly, is to scrap the existing capital stock early, for example, by removing even new internal combustion engine vehicles from the road. Of course, if we factor in the costs of worsening climate, the cost-benefit calculus changes. Consider, for example, the challenge of decarbonizing the U.S. fleet of some 200 million light-duty vehicles. Suppose as an illustration that cars last for 20 years and that 10 million vehicles are currently retired each year and replaced with 10 million newly produced vehicles. The industry's production capacity is geared to 10 million sales per year. In order to shift the U.S. automobile fleet to electric vehicles, the industry must be retooled. Let us stipulate, for purposes of illustration, that converting the U.S. automotive industry to the production of 10 million BEVs will require a decade. To provide the time not only to retool existing production lines and to design the new vehicles, but also the time to build new supply chains for batteries and other components. As of 2030, all new U.S. vehicle production and sales will be electric. Between 2030 and 2050, the entire fleet of 200 million internal combustion vehicles will be phased out and replaced by the electric ones. Could this happen instead by 2040? That would require replacing 200 million vehicles during a 10-year period, 2030 to 2040. Annual production and sales of electric vehicles in the 2030s would have to average 20 million vehicles, twice the current industrial capacity. Yet after 2040, the production and sales would fall for many years because of the young age of the BEV fleet. The production boom would be replaced by a bust. In the long run, we would have actual production reverting to 10 million per year on average. Moreover, the early conversion of the fleet would only reduce emissions to the extent that the U.S. power system also had been decarbonized and expanded by 2040 to accommodate the 200 million electric vehicles. Perhaps the early replacement of internal combustion engine vehicles by 2040 could be accomplished, but the extraordinary costs of the early scrappage of existing vehicles, the massive rise in overall vehicle production to 20 million per year during the 2030s, and the subsequent closure of industrial capacity after 2040 would effectively require the nationalization of the automobile industry, and the emissions from the temporary boom of automobile production could easily overwhelm any emissions reductions achieved by the early scrappage of the internal combustion engine fleet. This simple parable is meant to illustrate a point. I didn't notice that it was a parable, perhaps because it was embodied too much in technical language, but you'll need until 2050 to achieve full decarbonization. Even then, we'll be incurring many extraordinary costs to meet the mid-century target, including the early closure of hundreds or even thousands of fossil fuel-based power plants Yes, we should have started decarbonization in earnest in the 1990s by adopting the Kyoto Protocol. Instead, it was spurned by the U.S. Senate. So here we are in 2020 with far too little time left for climate safety. Yet we must proceed. Zero carbon power generation can probably be achieved by 2040 to 2045. New York State I'm frozen for a moment here because my machine. Oh, there we go. My machine appeared to be frozen for a minute. Zero carbon power generation can probably be achieved nationwide by 2040 to 2045. New York State has set 2040, and California has set 2045 as respective target dates. Given the older ages of most existing coal-fired and many gas-fired plants, such a timeline would permit the natural retirement of most carbon-based power generation, with only its modest need for early closures. Market forces will also lead to some early closures as the capital inclusive costs of new renewable power generation decline below the marginal operating costs of some existing thermal plants. The conversion of the automobile and trucking fleet will require most of the period to 2050. We should anticipate and regulate that as of 2030, all new sales of light-duty vehicles will be zero-emission vehicles, mostly battery electric vehicles. Yes, I think more than simply regulate may be necessary here. I think we should anticipate and mandate that as of 2030, all new sales, vehicles will be zero-emission vehicles. Most the battery electric vehicles will be EVs. New buildings could become all electric within the next few years, since the technologies to build those heating and cooking systems are already at hand. The retrofitting of existing buildings, however, will take far more time, almost surely to 2050. I think that may depend on how much we spend on the retrofitting, of existing buildings. I'm not sure the same kinds of limits would apply to those, as apply to replacing the fleet, of automobiles. The best current estimates put the incremental cost of decarbonization around 1% of GDP each year, or perhaps even less. Decarbonization will neither break the budget nor massively spur the economy by itself. But yes, it can save the planet from environmental ruin. Or maybe, unless we're so far down the road that we have to proceed even faster than we think. The extra costs incurred to shift from fossil fuels to zero carbon energy include the incremental costs of actually providing electricity with renewables rather than fossil fuels, of shifting to zero emission vehicles, of buildings using green electricity for heating, ventilation, and cooking rather than fossil fuels, and the incremental costs of decarbonizing several hard sectors, including aviation, ocean shipping, steelmaking, cement, and petrochemicals. And a quote, smart meters turn electricity consumption on and off depending on the needs of users, and shifts in market prices that reflect supply and demand conditions. The incremental costs also include all the complementary infrastructure needed to operate a zero carbon energy system. For example, the U.S. will need additional grid transmission to connect high quality renewable energy, Southwest Solar Energy, the wind energy from the Midwest, Canadian hydropower, and offshore wind energy with final users. New charging stations across the nation will be needed for the electric vehicles. New catenary lines, overhead electric lines, may be added to interstate highway lanes for the electric trucks. Extensive new investments in 5G capacity will be needed to manage smart grids, and so forth. Several recent studies have nonetheless concluded the overhaul of the energy system will not be large compared to the size of the economy. My Columbia colleague Jeffrey Heal provided an especially insightful estimate of transition costs, showing that renewable energy plus storage can cut our U.S. emissions by 80% by 2050 for less than 1% of GDP per year. Also, another colleague, Jim Williams of the University of San Francisco, has similarly calculated an 80% reduction of U.S. emissions by 2050 could be accomplished for around 0.8% of GDP per year. A recent study on global decarbonization by 2050, led by Christian Breyer at the Lappeenranta University of Technology in Finland, concludes that the levelized costs of 100% renewable energy system in 2050 would be less than the costs today. For example, €52 per megawatt hour, compared with €70 today. In a 2015 study by Alexander McDonald and co-authors found that CO2 emissions from the U.S. electricity sector can be reduced by 80% compared to 1990 levels without any increase in the levelized cost of electricity. Moreover, the transition to renewable energy will create many more jobs than will be lost in the closure of the fossil fuel sector. See the companion article by Harold Harold Meyerson. A major ongoing study by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, reportedly finds that a U.S., quote, supergrid, unquote, connecting high-quality renewable energy resources with major population centers would cost around $80 billion in total, a mere 0.4% of GDP as a one-time investment, and would actually deliver economic benefits of at least twice that sum. There are fears that the NREL findings are being suppressed or delayed by the Trump administration. I should underscore that most of the studies to date examine incremental costs of 80% decarbonization rather than 100% of decarbonization. It is likely true that the marginal cost of decarbonization will rise as we approach 100%. As, for example, Jessica Tranzik's team at MIT has determined the storage costs to back up 95% of all renewable power systems would be roughly half of the cost to back up 100% of the system. Since 100% requires vastly more storage to protect against an extremely rare shortfall of intermittent energy. In summary, the gist of recent studies is that decarbonization is not hugely expensive as a portion of the total economy. The estimates suggest that 80% decarbonization can be reached at a cost of 1% of GDP or less per year. Complete decarbonization by 2050 could perhaps cost up to 2% of GDP per year, taking into account the higher marginal cost of decarbonizing the harder sectors, but could in fact end up being much less costly than 2% of GDP and even below 1% of GDP. Would it be worth the extra cost to accelerate decarbonization in the U.S. to 2040 rather than 2050, assuming that it would be technically feasible. Sachs says the answer is no. U.S. CO2 emissions from energy in 2020 will be around 5.3 billion tons. If we compare a linear ramp down to zero by 2050 and a faster linear ramp down by 2040, the faster ramp down would reduce U.S. Emissions of CO2 by around 27 billion tons. That in turn would reduce the atmospheric concentration of CO2 by around 1.8 parts per million, with reduced global warming on the order of 0.01 degrees as of 2100. In other words, it would be negligible. The short-term effect on temperature would be even less. Now, we must remember that an accelerated decarbonization might not actually cut the cumulative emissions as assumed by a steeper linear ramp down because of the larger buildup of new industrial capacity, e.g. the electric vehicle production needed in the accelerated transition. Even if the entire world was somehow to decarbonize on a linear ramp down by 2040 rather than 2050, the reduction of global warming as of 2100 would be on the order of 0.1 degrees with smaller short-term effects. Yes, such a reduction in warming would definitely be beneficial. Each 0.1 degree warming hurts. Yet the practical time needed to phase out the world's existing fossil fuel capital stock, build massive new infrastructure, retool major global industries such as automotive, such as increasing the auto production and solving countless technological challenges, all while attending to the urgent sustainable development needs of more than 6 billion people in developing countries, argues overwhelmingly for a timeline to 2050 rather than 2040. Decarbonizing globally by 2050 will itself be a near miracle, one that requires a global breakthrough in politics and policies starting imminently and carried forward for decades. Okay, it sort of strikes me, I know this would be terribly, terribly unpopular, but it sort of strikes me that we could greatly reduce the vehicle fleet here in the United States, and thus we could lighten the load so that we wouldn't have to scale up our industrial capacity by quite so much if we were to ration for a while, or for decades, cars, by other words, light vehicles, to 1 car per family. Okay. If we were to do that, then we probably would not need to double the capacity, of auto production. We might be able to get there with 130%, of current production. I wonder what that would do in terms of accelerating decarbonization to 2040 if we did something like that. Just a thought. Anyway, a national policy framework for decarbonization. The national policy framework for decarbonization should aim at 3 overriding objectives. The end of U.S. energy-based emissions of CO2 by 2050, a low-cost pathway for the transition, and a fair transition to address vulnerable groups and regions, including workers in fossil fuel-related sectors who will lose their jobs in the transition. Regions currently dependent on fossil fuel production and low-income households. And a quote, the Green New Deal should involve all levels of government, including state and local, rather than put all the responsibility at the federal level, of course. An effective plan should involve distinct strategies for each of the four major energy sectors: power generation, transport, buildings, and industry, with special attention paid to key subsectors, such as light-duty vehicles, intercity trucking, aviation, and ocean shipping. The plan should distinguish between the easy and hard sectors, including R&D for the hard sectors. The plan should address several dimensions of public policy, including timelines for phasing out fossil fuel-related capital stocks, allocations of responsibilities among federal, state, and local governments, carbon pricing, including carbon taxes, feed-in tariffs, and renewable energy auctions, R&D outlays for the hard technologies, public investments in interstate transmission charging stations, catenary lines, government fleets and buildings, and other public infrastructure, financing for a fair transition, job retraining, income supplements, and regional development. I noticed there that there's no specification of a job guarantee program there. The Green New Deal, at least as outlined by Bernie Sanders, has a job guarantee program in it. Also, I don't actually notice any changes in the living wage as part of this program, just comments. Public financing for actually building for retrofitting buildings. Also, U.S. international within the Paris Agreement. There are two heatedly debated questions that dominate the policy debate. The first is over the use of carbon pricing, especially carbon taxation. The second involves the allocation of responsibilities across levels of government, carbon regulation and pricing. There are two basic policy approaches to pollution control that apply to decarbonization: quantity regulation and corrective pricing. I'm going to skip most of that paragraph and just point out quantity regulation is the preferred option when the technological alternatives are well known, easy to monitor, and already cost effective. Corrective pricing makes sense when the alternatives are uncertain, are difficult to monitor, and with highly varying cost effectiveness depending on the context. In those cases, a corrective price, e.g. a tax on the pollutant, allows markets to search for low-cost solutions and to promote innovations. The most important international pollution abatement to date has been the highly successful global phase-out of ozone-depleting chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. This was governed by the 1987 Montreal Protocol and subsequent amendments, and this, of course, was highly successful. There were many nations agreed to phase-outs, and we deployed a bit of corrective pricing, maybe in the form of import levies to block the importation of CFCs, while we curtailed our production very drastically. In the case of decarbonization, quantity regulation has been used for power plants both at the federal level and at the state level. I'll skip through some of this because we need to get going. Sachs suggests that quantity regulations for decarbonization will be most effective for four sectors: power generation for light-duty vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, and buildings. For these centers, the federal government should implement a timeline for phasing out the fossil fuel-based capital stock. For example, the federal government might actually mandate that all new power generation capacity in the U.S. should be zero carbon after a certain date, say 2022, and that remaining fossil fuel-based power generation should be phased out by a certain date, say 2040. Now that, is pretty definite. In other words, no new power plants built after a certain date that are not zero carbon. That's pretty strict. Similarly, the government should mandate that all new light-duty vehicles sold from 2030 onward must be zero-emission vehicles. That internal combustion light-duty vehicles must be phased out no later than 2020. A somewhat extended timeline might be given for trucks, e.g. all new trucks must be zero-emitting as of 2035. For buildings, a federal building code for new construction might actually mandate zero-emission buildings, electric heating, ventilation, cooking from 2030 onward. So this section then is giving some examples and some detail. He suggests that a carbon tax on aviation, ocean shipping, and other sectors might be introduced into law, but begin only as of 2025 or 2030. This will avoid an arbitrary rise in taxes on current capital, but will incentivize firms and industrial sectors to replace that capital in the future. And the Green New Deal should avoid the social eruptions that have recently hit France, Chile, and elsewhere, where governments introduced a new levy on transport that essentially taxed the existing capital, e.g. Automobile use, often in a regressive manner without any real opportunity for those hit by the levies to change their behavior in the short term. Carbon taxes should be phased in gradually and focus on future decisions rather than tax existing carbon-using capital that only serves to redistribute income regressively without affecting short-term emissions to any significant extent. And there's a reference to the companion article by James Boyce. And there's a section on federal, state, and local responsibilities. It's of interest, but I don't have time to go through it. One interesting suggestion is a federal green bank for utility sector financing, fair transition programs for vulnerable individuals and regions, and our leadership under the Paris Agreement. State renewable portfolio standards, and the acronym for the renewable portfolio standards is RPS. So each state should be directed, to adopt and implement a renewable portfolio standard, RPS program, that is consistent with the federal mandate to decarbonize by 2050. And then a quote, to defeat big oil, advocates need a specific plan that demonstrates how renewable energy alternatives will benefit every part of the country. And we go here to 3 states have recently set dates for 100% zero carbon power in their RPSs. California 2045, New Mexico 2045, and New York 2040. In total, 10 states, plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, have set zero by 2050 targets into law, or executive order. California 2045, Hawaii 2045, Maine 2050, Minnesota 2050, Nevada 2050, New Jersey 2050, New Mexico 2045, New York 2040, Washington State 2045, and Wisconsin 2050. Here's a section on financing decarbonization, and he says the first is through market transactions. The government mandates the zero carbon technology, and private sector producers invest and sell goods and services into the public. I think we're all very familiar with that. Second is through direct government supplying of zero carbon energy. In this case, the federal or state governments would directly own and operate power generation facilities and transmission and also distribution grids. They would recoup some or all of their costs through market sales by public enterprises, or alternatively finance their operations through general government, the revenues, general government revenues. And then he says there will be a mix of the two. Of course, here he's ignoring the possibility that some of it might be financed through new creation, of government money. So in that case, we might say there will be a mix of the three. Outlays for certain public infrastructure will require government financing. For example, the expansion of the interstate transmission grid for renewable energy as a natural monopoly. I'm not sure exactly what that means. The expanded transmission grid would be unsuitable for private ownership. Second case will be the federal outlays for a fair energy transition, which by design will not recoup a flow of earnings, and federal support for building retrofits will also likely be grants, rather than loans. He fails to mention here that there might also be grants for people to transition from gas vehicles, to electric vehicles. That kind of provision is certainly in Bernie's Green New Deal plan. Most of the transition costs, therefore, will be borne not by the federal and state governments, but by energy users, household and commercial buyers of electricity, car owners, and others. So his plan here is a little different from Bernie's plan. It has still has a large component, of federal funding, but it also has a good deal, of private sector funding. Since the zero-emission technologies are already close to the cost of fossil fuel-based technologies, there is no reason to anticipate any major hardships on energy users. As noted earlier, the total national cost might come to around 1 to 2% of national income per year, roughly 200 to 400 billion, with most of that borne by the private sector. And of course, the question there is, who in the private sector? And why would we do it through the private sector? Why would we want to do it through the private sector? Isn't that going to place a burden on people in the private sector when it's just as easy for the government to finance it? There are, of course, many technological uncertainties, and the total cost could end up higher or lower. Indeed, as the costs of clean energy continue to fall and as conservation measures improve, there would be many users who could experience net savings on their energy bills. Then, total federal outlays could reach up to $400 billion per year, or roughly 2% of GDP. If we factor in the total costs of new infrastructure spending on roads, fast rail, also protected coasts, and waterways, restored bridges, expanded transmission grids, and other infrastructure that is needed in any event given the decrepit state of U.S. infrastructure. This added spending is not the incremental cost of decarbonization, but the cost of restoring and modernizing America's overall infrastructure, a worthy and much-needed objective. Research and development outlays should also rise significantly. We may estimate that the research outlays for renewable energy should be of roughly the same scale as the biomedical research budget of the National Institutes of Health, roughly $30 billion per year. It is notable that Senator Bernie Sanders has presented a multi-year Green New Deal plan with a headline price tag of $16 trillion. Yes, it's multi-year, but it should be emphasized that it's a 10-year plan. It's from 2021 to 2030. So it's at $1.6 trillion per year. Okay. While Jeffrey Sachs here seems to be talking about a plan that would run from now until 2050, and that would involve expenditures of about $400 billion per year. And there's a big difference in concentration of costs over time, and there's also probably a big difference in total cost because the headline price tag is for the first 10 years. It's not for the full period of getting to the Green New Deal. The main reason, Sachs says, for this enormous sum is Bernie's call for the federal government to build and operate a new renewable energy system, essentially displacing the existing utility industry in the process. In the plan that I have sketched, I assume that the utility sector, not the federal government, will bear the investment costs. Sanders also includes generous outlays for retrofitting buildings and for highly accelerated replacement of the existing vehicle fleet. My cost estimates, and those are the studies I have quoted, are based on decarbonization by 2050 in line with the IPCC 1.5 degree scenario. But of course we also have to mention that Jeffrey Sachs himself has said that recent studies suggests that maybe we need to get down to a 1 degree Celsius scenario, and to do that very soon. Surely that is going to cost more. Getting started in 2020 for the next presidency, the proponents of the Green New Deal will need to do their homework if they're to triumph in Congress over the big oil lobby. Public opinion is in favor of climate action, but that doesn't matter in Congress. What counts, it may matter in the new Congress in 2021 if Bernie wins and gets the Congress he wants. What counts is who pays the campaign bills. Unfortunately, the answer is big oil. In the 2016 federal election cycle, the oil and gas industry gave $56 million in campaign financing to Republican candidates, with just $8 million to Democratic candidates. In the 2018 election cycle, the Republicans received $43 million compared with just $6 million for the Democrats. I guess I have to point out here, these are extremely sizable sums for a single industry, but they pale before the amount of money that was spent in 2016 in the federal election cycle. In that cycle, $6 billion was spent on the 2016 campaign, if we count federal, state, and local campaign financing expenditures. So, the $64 million that was put out by the fossil fuel industry, okay, by big oil, by the oil, okay, and gas industry. It doesn't appear to account for coal here. That total of 64 million is a very small percentage, roughly 1% of what was spent overall. So if public opinion could shift and markedly shift, okay, against oil, the 64 billion or spending on that scale going up to even 100 million would not amount to a hill of beans if the whole world were to turn against the oil and gas lobby. To beat big oil, the Green New Deal advocates need a specific plan, one that demonstrates how decarbonization will work and how it will benefit every part of the country. With such a plan, Green New Deal advocates will be able to turn public opinion into votes in Congress. And then he goes on, okay, to point out that that kind of plan was actually presented by Eisenhower, okay, President Eisenhower, in relation to the Interstate Highway Program in 1953. That at first conservatives in Congress were reluctant to support the program because they couldn't see what was in it for them. But when the Bureau of Public Roads of the Department of Commerce put out a book of maps showing the general location of the proposed highway systems in dozens of major metropolitan areas, suddenly congressmen could see the benefits of the new highway system passing through their district. The good news is that the specifics of a Green New Deal to decarbonize energy are finally coming into focus. We now understand clearly the key pillars of decarbonization. We now understand that but today's technologies can get most of the transition accomplished, that even the hard sectors can be decarbonized after a bit more R&D. And the truly great news is that all this can be achieved at very low cost. Decarbonization to save the planet is actually the greatest bargain, okay, of our time. Well, the fact that decarbonization is not going to cost quite so much is fine, but and not only fine, okay, but is good news. But the slant of this article, in my view, has too much emphasis on that and too little emphasis on the heart of the Green New Deal, which is that the transition be a just one, and that it be a transition that is transformative of society. The way Jeffrey Sachs is talking about this, we don't see much in the way of social and structural transformation. We see a technological transformation, and we see talking and writing about how we can get there by spending a little more, okay, on taxes, okay, and by having federal expenditures rise from perhaps 19 to 20%, okay, of GDP to roughly 22%, okay, of by GDP. That's small ball when it comes to the Green New Deal. And the idea of having most of the Green New Deal financed by the private sector, I don't think that is what we want if we're looking for a just transition to to a Green New Deal. The Sanders Plan has a much larger public component of the Green New Deal, and it's much more comprehensive in its focus of the justice of the transition. Okay, so other than getting to your comments, I'm going to leave this here for tonight. I see that I originally scheduled on the 3 articles here, but this article was so comprehensive and required so much in the way, of commentary, that I see that I won't be able to get to the other 2 articles. So what I'll say now is, keeping this article in mind, what I want to do for tomorrow is to come back to this topic and do a part 2 for you that talks further about the technical path in a relatively short article, which was written actually by Mara Prentice, and a longer but not so very long article on how do we pay for a zero emissions economy, which is the pollen article. And that article has something more to say about how we pay for it. So the topic will be the same except for the addition of part 2. And in the meantime, I'm now going to shift over to your comments after I remind you to please share, like, and subscribe when I get the YouTube video up, which will be very shortly after I end the stream. And I'd also like to ask you to please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And thank you for considering that. And I want to thank also my regular contributors for all that you are currently doing. I greatly, greatly appreciate it. Now, I'd like to shift to your comments and see what you've been saying. Dale Weaver has joined, and Matt Hildebrand has joined. Hi, Matt. How are you? And Randy says, retrofitting with hot water solar is also much easier. Yes, I remember, Randy, that you're very big in that area. The use of hot water solar energy should be considered more seriously, as the storage is much simpler and non-toxic. 2 ways of water storage tanks and earth storage is so simple and very cost effective. Hot water heating is also healthier than forced air, as commonly used in buildings. Steam heat. We used to do very well on steam heat, I believe. Susan Eldridge joined, and Ernest Jones joined, and also Liz Netherland has joined. And Steve Wolfbrand has been here. Joanne Owenhouse, Riccardio has joined. Lana Dell joined. Randy Hedgebeth has joined, and he says, "Hey Joe, I'm here. Nice to see you, Randy." Greg Malderd has joined. Thank you, Greg. Thank you for the shares. And thank you all who shared. I noticed Steve Lovett has been here as well. Thank you for coming, Steve. Okay, Bonnie has been here. Thank you, Bonnie. And my daughter Devora has joined, maybe just now. Hi, honey. So, any more comments or questions, at this point? There's a lot to this, right? There's much detail. It's very complicated. The 1 to 2% estimates for decarbonization are very promising. I personally think, though, that Jeff Sachs was perhaps a little less than innovative in trying to think through how the time for the transition might be shortened. Just off the top of my head, I suggested that maybe we don't need a vehicle fleet of 200 million cars anymore. That maybe we need something closer to 100 million cars. Okay? And then this would create a different situation with respect to rebuilding the industrial plant for the production, okay, of the electric vehicles. It would be much easier. Okay, and I'm sure there are other ways to speed up the transition, okay, as well. It seems to me Randy has put forward some interesting suggestions here tonight when it comes to retrofitting the old buildings. So that's also significant as well. So it may be possible to make the transition by 2040. I think there should be more consideration given to that. Maybe we'll find some suggestions in the Mara Apprentice article that we still have to go through. And we'll have a bit of a different view in terms of how it's going to be paid for in the Jeffrey Sachs article as well. But I have to say that when we get to the Jeffrey Sachs article, we still will not be looking at the use, okay, of MMT methods to pay for the decarbonization program. So there, of course, I'm going to have quite a few suggestions about some further alternatives to financing this. Okay. So, any further questions or comments? Okay, I'll wait a minute or two to see if you have additional comments. And if not, I'll say good night for tonight. I'll be back tomorrow at some time during the 9 o'clock hour. I seem to be settling in sometime between 9 p.m. and 9:15, depending on how much I misjudge the amount of time it will take for me to get ready for the live stream. Okay, anyway, thanks for coming. And I'll see you tomorrow. Good night.